Hey, welcome to another GrainTALK webinar. Today we have Al Mussell from the Agri-Food Economic Systems to talk about COVID-19 and supply chains, what we've learned and what we can expect. Today's webinar is sponsored by Climate Field View. Al, I'm going to pass it over to you and you can go right ahead.
Very good. Well, thanks, Paige, and thanks very much to the Grain Farmers of Ontario for the invitation, and for those of you tuning in, thanks very much for taking the time. I hope you find this interesting. Topic I was going to discuss this afternoon is COVID-19 and ag and food supply chains. I think the important point here, early October, we're sitting here perhaps into the second wave, in fact, probably into the second wave. So we shouldn't be talking about this thing in the past tense. But what I'd like to discuss is maybe a little bit what we've learned so far and perhaps what we can expect. I'd like to start with a little bit of a sort of a conceptual view that may be able to guide us in terms of how to think about these things. Then a bit on the experience that we've had so far. Then what we've learned based on that experience and what the implications are. Let me start with a little bit of the conceptual to help us try and understand how we think about these things as best we can. The first thing about disruption is there's kind of two ways to think about it, or two different aspects. One is risk. Now, risk is an uncertain outcome from a distribution of known bounds. So something along the lines of the roll of a dice, or well, you can think about pricing in this way. The price of a commodity is obviously bounded by zero, or practically speaking, something above that, and then there's a historic high. Then we have something related, which is uncertainty. Uncertainty is a randomness in outcome, but with unknown bounds. So an example is an event that's never happened before. You have no experience to condition your expectations on, so it's no longer risk. It's just flat out uncertainty. One of the things we've learned about dealing with risk in uncertainty is that for whatever reason in people's psychology, we have more difficulty assessing and planning for highly unlikely but very significant events than we do things that are much more likely or frequently observed but far less significant. So, for example, we have no problem pricing, writing, or evaluating the cost of a commodity option. But when we've got something that's a once-in-a-lifetime risk that could be of huge significance, we have a great deal more difficulty assessing that. And that's sometimes called the black swan problem in philosophy or psychology, but that's when we're dealing with something of the magnitude that we've experienced with COVID-19. I think that's important to think about. Second aspect I'd like to follow up here with in a moment is the supply chain, or it's really more like a web, the bottlenecks in it, the redundancies that may exist in that chain, and its ability to handle surges or pulses in demand. Now this gets what could get hopelessly complex, and I'm going to try and prevent that from happening. When you think about the capacity of the system, we know in ag and food, and there's any number of examples that I'm sure many of you can think of, we need to be able to use the capacity that we have in place to keep unit costs from rising. The flip side is if we have to operate at well below capacity, the unit costs go up. At the same time, it's costly, but if we have redundancies either in the form of inventories or in capacity in the system, they can be deployed when they're needed to extend capacity and or product supply. In agriculture, and it almost doesn't matter what segment of agriculture you're in, our supply chains are often very long, they can be very complex, and in the context of a sudden major catastrophe, they're long enough and complex enough that the bottlenecks can sneak up and come out of the woodwork at us, and we don't see it coming. Secondly, for specific segments of the supply chain, you know, we run day in and day out, and we may not know where its true limits are. And in times of emergencies, those capacities can become binding and surprise us. One of the curious things that I'll go into in a moment is when you have a type of failure in a specific supply chain segment, it can end up strengthening the other alternative segments or competing segments, as the case may be, just as a result of the failure of the one. I mean, nothing else needs to have changed. And that, I think that could prove important to us over time. A fourth sort of conceptual issue is I'm calling it microeconomy versus macroeconomy. Macroeconomy, you know, these are things like exchange rates, interest rates, financial failures. And you know, when you think back, most of the global scale crises that you can think of, you know, the 2008 situation, the Great Depression, others, most of these are really macroeconomic in origin. It's a failure of the financial sector. It's a failure of trade policy. It's a failure of international politics of one sort or another. Interestingly, what we're going to see is, of course, COVID-19 was not like that. COVID-19 was essentially a micro failure just multiplied at a global scale. You know, really as simple as people not being able to go to work, people not being able to have the same purchase habits as they've had before, and that just simply multiplied itself at a global level. Whatever interruptions you get, whether it's from microeconomy or macroeconomy sources, they play into the existing global economic context. And as you're going to see here in a moment, what that ends up doing is it accelerates or accentuates some of the problems that we already had that pre-existed COVID-19. And I'll quickly go through some of them, but many of you are familiar with it. The global trade environment, which has changed dramatically over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, and a shifting geopolitical environment in which Canada feels very much like a small country and somewhat set adrift. This is a little graph that I've tried to use to try and represent some of the difficulties of large-scale shocks to a system. And I borrowed this from the ecology people rather than economics. And the reason I like this is in economics, one of the shortcomings of economics, in my understanding of it, is it deals with only one equilibrium that supply and demand are trying to bring together. It doesn't deal with the possibility that there could be a couple of different possible equilibriums. And let me explain what I mean by that. The horizontal axis here is measuring increasing levels of shock to a system. You know, it could be weather. It could be, in this case, we're talking about disease. The vertical axis is system performance, and you can think about that as GDP of a country, earnings of a company, farm, etc. Well, if you think of this thing moving from left to right, you know, there's sort of two bowls here. The bowl on the left here, that red ball moves from left to right on a regular basis, and you know what? Our system is pretty robust. It can handle shocks, but there's a vertical hatched line here. If it goes beyond that, then we got a problem, because it's going to fall into that lower bowl. And once it gets down in there, again, it'll be fairly stable within that bowl, but it's at a much lower level of system performance. I'll give you an example, and you know, I'll apologize in advance. A number of my examples that I'll use come from the pork industry, but you know, looking into this fall, before we even get into the prospect of disruptions due to COVID. In North America, there's quite a large number of market hogs that are going to be marketed relative to processing capacity that exists. If we get in a situation where we've got absenteeism due to COVID-19, or once again the food service sector of the economy becomes dramatically locked down, you run the risk that you'll simply have significantly more hogs that need to be marketed than there is capacity to handle them at the North American level. Something like what we had in 1998. Well, and the situation like that is one in which the red ball here would move beyond that hump and go into the lower level. What does the lower level mean? Well, that's a situation in which maybe some producers that want to be able to market their pigs are simply have no home for them, and those pigs need to be euthanized. The price of hogs in North America goes down to dramatically low levels. And there'll be some people who say, look, enough of this, I've had enough of raising pigs, and they go out of it. And then as a consequence of that, you get your processing infrastructure that has to shrink to deal with the hog supply that it has available to it. What you then have is you've got a stable system in the sense of plant capacity and hog production in a local or even provincial national area, operating at a lower level, and it's down in that lower level, and it can operate within a fairly stable environment. But of course, what's happened in the intervening period is the aggregate profitability of the sector has gone down somewhat dramatically, and there's nothing to suggest here that that's not a permanent situation. This plays itself out in any number of different aspects. When we get into the supply chain itself, it's really more of a web. I've kind of drawn a red box here around the if you want to think of that as sort of the farm segment and some of the basic functions that are entailed. And I've really tried to simplify this as much as I can. You've got your suppliers, then you've got your supplier's supplier. Maybe your supplier's supplier is also an entity that supplies you with some inputs. You've got logistics up in the left-hand corner that moves everything, everywhere there's an arrow, maybe basically with the exception of what's in the red box, is being moved by the logistics system. You've got your customers, customers, and at some point down the way, you've got the end consumer themselves. Then sort of up in the upper level, you've got the financing infrastructure and the risk-bearing or insurance aspect of the chain, the agricultural policy and trade policy that governs it, and then the capacity and activity levels that we have in the regulatory and food inspection segment. The difficulty with, or whether it's a difficulty, this is a complex and potentially lengthy supply chain. And, I'm going to go into this a little bit later. I think most of us in agriculture have thought about this system and risk in it from the standpoint of, maybe trade interruptions due to trade policies of other countries, including subsidy and protection policies, or issues around plant and animal diseases. Well, those factors hit specific elements of this chain. We hadn't really thought much about a human disease side of this, but the human disease side, of course, can hit any one of these nodes. And when it does, it will create a bunch of adjustment in all of the rest. And, the experience, and I'm sure many of you will perhaps agree with this, this tends to all back up on the farm, of course. But, if your customer's customer, if they have a financial failure, they have people who can't come to work because the public health department has shut down the plant for some period of time to clear it from COVID, et cetera. Well, they've lost that business, and this immediately will back up to the farm level. Think about another case, and again, I'll go back and use a pork example. back in March, we went through a period of time where there were concerns about CFIA inspectors in plants and their willingness to be present in the plant if there were employees in the plant who were positive for COVID-19. Well, if there's no, if the CFIA vets, inspection staff aren't prepared to be present in the plant, then there's no slaughter or processing that can occur. And immediately everything backs up to the farm. And doesn't take long, you've got a bit of a crisis on your hands. On the supplier side, you can think of any number of examples. I mean, one of the ones that maybe some of you have run across and who'd have figured, but you know, in terms of thinking about your supplier or your own, who'd have figured that Ontario, as far as I could tell, would be largely out of lumber, pressure treated lumber in particular. And I guess that's a function of people planning projects around their homes or whatever, and a surge of demand, and to some extent the pressure treating or other aspects of the lumber supply chain, which I don't pretend to be very familiar with, they just can't keep up. And I know myself, we've got lumber ordered, and the lumberyard won't even give us a date when it might be in. Well, and of course that's all affected by this situation, which is a human resource issue. On the logistics side, well, we know with the trucking side of it, we had trouble getting drivers the best of times. Now to try and get drivers that are prepared to haul product down into some parts of the U.S. Or even locally for that matter, that's difficult. By times we've had great difficulty getting shipping containers, and in fact, Bloomberg published an article back in, would have been about May, saying basically there aren't enough ocean-going shipping containers in the world to keep up with the demand for them. That limits everything, and everything backs up. One aspect of this, and you know, I've tried to capture this with this little representation out of the U.S. and maybe some of you have seen this before. You know, it's often used to illustrate that the farm share of the consumer's dollar in the U.S. is pretty low, and it's probably not a lot different in Canada. But you know, one aspect of a supply chain is the redundancy, which is inventory and holding, you know, sort of safety stocks of product. And when I look at this, you know, there's no line item across here. I guess it would come in maybe wholesale trade or maybe finance and insurance that screams out at you that there's a segment of the U.S. food supply chain that's charged with holding a safety stock of food in the event of a disaster. I went and looked at it for 2013, and you know, you will see that the share of the wholesale trade is a little higher. Same thing with finance, but really not very much higher. I'm not sure you could read a whole lot into that. And of course, you know, the whole thing is these are essentially percentages, and what you see, at least for these two time periods, is more and more of the value of the food dollar is going into what I would call consumer attributes, food, service, or retail. And it basically comes out of everything else. But there's nothing here that screams at you that we have some sort of safety stock of product in the event of disaster. And one of the things I'll discuss here in a moment is, well, you know, we've gone, our supply chain has gone so far toward the grocery distribution center model of moving food into stores from processors and handlers and then of course from the farm down to that point, that we don't have that. We don't really have that capacity off to the side to deal with a significant disruption, and that tells us where a lot of the problems came from back in the spring. Global trade policy and COVID didn't cause any of the problems in global trade policy that I'm going to discuss here, but rather we had this to contend with before we even got into this. I'll just give you a quick overview. For me, where we are today on trade policy started in 2017 when the new Trump administration in January of 2017 withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Shortly thereafter, with the target I believe to have been China on steel and aluminum, they began to levy duties on countries having to do with steel and aluminum. Of course, Canada was caught in that for a period of time. You get into around about June, July 2018, China retaliated against the U.S. On a range of products, but many of them were farm products, most notably soybeans and pork. At the same time, of course, we were going through our own set of tensions with China. Well, this went on through the summer, and by August of 2018, it had enough of an effect on U.S. farm prices that the U.S. enacted the first of its market facilitation program payments. And of course, that's gone on again in 2019. And one thing I think I'm fairly certain that you probably would have had additional market facilitation payments, but of course, once you got into COVID, now we have that essentially replaced with a COVID food assistance program, which is another type of ad hoc support over and above what U.S. agriculture receives under the Farm Bill. Also in 2018, NAFTA was renewed. We call it CUSMA in Canada. They call it USMCA in the U.S. But there are also a number of arrangements that the U.S. established with trading partners that don't really live up to the standard of a trade agreement. One is U.S.-Japan, and basically, essentially what happened was the U.S. hung the threat of automotive tariffs against Japan out. And in return for that, Japan offered them or provided them with the same access or almost the same access that they would have gotten under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they'd withdrawn from. So in other words, the U.S. got the same types of benefits in terms of access to the Japanese market that we did, but didn't give up anything in return. We did. And then similarly on U.S.-China. These agreements, U.S., China, and Japan, are heavily oriented toward ag and food. They don't cover the fulsome set of all the different segments of the economy, and as a result of that, they very likely run afoul of some aspects of the WTO agreement. Although I doubt very much anybody's prepared to take the U.S. to task on that right now. It also looks like we're going to have new disputes. I mean, there's been any number of major trade disputes. The one that comes to mind immediately is the Airbus Boeing dispute between the U.S. and the EU. That's in the midst of coming to resolution with retaliation. By all appearances now, it looks like we're going to be into a trade dispute with the U.S. over blueberries, mainly aimed at Mexico, but we're going to be ensnared in that. In the intervening period, of course, as a consequence of the ongoing difficulties that the U.S. has with the World Trade Organization, and particularly the appeals process, the U.S. Blocked appointments to the U.S. Or the WTO appellate body to the point where now appeals cannot be heard. And oddly enough, just in this late summer, of course, we had a WTO panel ruling on softwood lumber against the U.S., and they promptly appealed. Well, of course, they knew full well that wouldn't go anywhere. So there we sit. There's really no way to resolve that dispute. And the big one, of course, is another WTO dispute panel ruled on behalf of China in a case it brought against these Section 301 duties that the U.S. had enacted. And surely the U.S. will appeal that. And that just renders the whole rules-based trade system in question, quite frankly. Now, all this was occurring in the context of African swine fever, the break that China had with African swine fever that has gone throughout the country in China, and leaves us with this unprecedented global protein shortage. So whatever happened with COVID-19 was going to have to confront this environment. Now, the second thing, of course, that's been going on is major changes in geopolitics. Now, these have been phrased largely as a U.S.-China rivalry, and there's no question. One thing I wanted everybody to be aware of is the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a system of alliances that China has been building through making investments in infrastructure. A lot of this infrastructure is it's railways, it's ports, it's in some cases it's medical research, it's everything from soup to nuts. The idea is that it will bring raw materials, including, you have to assume, food, into China that they will build their value added sector on. What I'm trying to illustrate with this chart is, with the TPP, when the United States was in it, one of the rationales for that was to contain China, or as China developed economically, to have that occur in such a way that they didn't run roughshod all over everybody else. Well, I look at this map and I'm trying to figure out, well, who's containing whom here? The areas that I've circled here are areas that, for the most part, have not accepted any of the Chinese investment under this Belt and Road. I think you can ignore New Zealand. That's not a small amount of investment there. But it looks to me more like they've contained us than the other way around. And we still have some areas that I've labeled as political economic battlegrounds, and there's lots to go on there. Brazil, Argentina, there's lots of apparently private Chinese investment in the ag and food sector there. And China seems to be trying to push influence in Eastern Europe in such a way that it'll weaken the European Union. Now, this is important because where's the food insecurity in the world? Well, and again, this is quite apart from COVID-19. This happens to be a chart here that I pulled that shows the level of undernourished people, and by and large they're in China and India, and of course that's because China and India are the largest countries in population, of course. But if you think about food security and this idea of undernourishment as ultimately mapping back to acres of land, then it's not the proportion of the population you're worried about, it's the number of souls to feed. And this is in East and Southeast Asia, chiefly with China. And I'm going to come back to that because that's where your food security is, but who do we think is going to feed them? Well, this is a chart here that was given to the World Trade Organization by the OECD a year ago this past summer. And these are their long-term projections. And if you look at these agricultural trade balances, well, who's the most deficit? Well, it's South and East Asia. And the chart that I just had here explains exactly why. Well, where are they going to get their food? Well, by and large, they're getting it from North and South America. They're getting it from us. A little bit from Australia and Eastern Europe, but everywhere else in the world is, on a value basis at least, food deficit. Now this becomes curious because, as we know, Canadian agricultural trade with China has not exactly proven to be the easiest thing to manage, and the complexities of that environment and that relationship with China were further complicated, of course, with COVID-19. Okay, so thinking back to March, April, May, things quieted down for the later summer. What happened? And I think everybody probably has their own personal experience with what happened to them, and hopefully I don't miss much of that, but I'm trying to deal in sort of a high level. Well, we had a number of incidents of dampening capacity in processing and marketing facilities of one sort or another because there were sufficient cases of COVID-19 in plants that either local public health authorities or whomever said, look, plants got to close for 14 days or however long. this backs up immediately, and it causes any number of spillover effects that I think I guess speaking for myself, I kind of felt going into this that I understood how these supply chains work pretty well, but I certainly was surprised and got a lesson, and I'm not sure if anybody really knew exactly what was going to happen. So to give you I'll give you a good example, and I'm going to pick on pork once again. With the decline in food service, you had to decline for some of your edible offal products, particularly your fats, both your beef fat and your pork fat, to the point where there was literally no market for some of that product. Well, that immediately takes some of the bid price out of your live hog, or similarly with slaughter cattle. But it creates a bigger problem than just that. Then you got to figure out what you're going to do with this. So, okay, well, all that material is now going to have to go to rendering. Well, do you have the off-peak capacity in rendering to be able to handle what they were doing before, plus adding that in? And then, of course, at various points where we had pork processing plants close. It's a different issue with beef processing plants because we could park cattle a little bit better. But pork can't wait the same way. Well, then when a plant closes, the pigs have to go somewhere else. And we worried very much about what happens if we have to get into euthanizing pigs, and they have to go to rendering too. We don't have infinite rendering capacity. Well, what is the rendering capacity? People started to scramble around and ask. Now, fortunately, we had done some work with regard to animal disease preparedness that helped us understand this a little bit, but we never expected it was going to work like this. Now, of course, the direct effects on the farm were most seriously felt in horticulture. And I feel like I'm not maybe close enough in touch with exactly how the various and sundry elements of horticulture will have fared in 2020. We know that in the spring of 2020, as this was a developing situation, there were some producers who sort of took the view of, look, I can't handle this. Bringing in foreign workers was enough work as it was. If I've got to park them for 14 days and I've got to have additional housing and then deal with what happens with some of them, if they do get sick, what happens, forget it, I'm out of it. But there was some of that. Then, of course, we know some of the instances where there were, in some cases, larger farms that had quite a number of people off sick. The whole situation must have been a nightmare. To what extent that resulted in product being left in the field or never planted or never, the crop husbandry not being able to be done properly, I don't think we know yet. But certainly a stressful situation for the producers involved. And I wonder also about the farm workers, because one of the elements that came through was greater focus on working hours of farm employees. And some of them, as many of you probably know, ultimately got limited on their work week. And people who come to work in Canada from the Caribbean or Mexico, they don't come for a vacation. They come to work. They want to work long hours. So some of them, I'm sure their income was affected by this. And I hope we continue they want to come back next year and off into the future, but that's a concern. Secondly, we had a surge in demand for some products. Everybody knows about toilet paper, of course, in grocery stores. People rediscovered baking. So there was flour, etc. And, from what I can tell overall, we managed that shock in the system. We got through that one okay. We were robust to that one. On the export side, Canada is a major exporter of any number of particularly farm products and also food products. What we encountered was an environment in which some exporters began to step out of the export arena. You can think of a few examples: Russia on wheat, Kazakhstan on wheat and especially flour, Thailand on rice. And when that began to happen, there are some countries that are chronically importers. So you think about some Middle Eastern countries, Japan would be another case. There's any number of other examples. That type of behavior, I think, scares the dickens out of these countries that are dependent on imports. And this has long-term consequences. Some of you will remember the embargo put on by the United States in the early 1970s by President Nixon. One of the casualties of that were U.S. exports of soybeans to Japan. And what that led to, of course, was the Japanese seeking alternative suppliers to the United States and the early development of soybean production in Brazil. So this is taken very seriously. This kind of essentially it's hoarding behavior. The food service demand in the spring of the year simply collapsed. We found ways in Ontario and in other provinces over time to rekindle that so that we can eat on patios and social distance and so on and so forth. But for probably 2 months, it was just simply flat, and everybody probably knows that. One of the things that's maybe less transparent is that when the food service demand collapsed, the effective demand targeted to retailers strengthened. And one of the effects of that is that we were already had some concerns about market power of grocery retailers. That has now strengthened. And I'm going to come back to that again in a few minutes. The segments of the chain that were most closely tied to food service face softened demand. And I have an example that I think will be very intuitive to you here in a moment. Another factor that particularly would affect some of the crops that are addressed by grain farmers of Ontario were oil prices. When oil prices drop due to weakened gasoline demand, you get weaker ethanol demand. And really everything that is energy, whether it's petroleum energy or energy in the form of starch, everything tends to go down with it. That's something that I certainly got a strong reminder of. We initially were told that this was going to be there was a recession or economic depression, but it was going to be a V-shaped recovery. In other words, it was going to go down sharp, but it would come back up just as sharply. I don't know how many people really believed that. I didn't. I didn't have any specific theory to counter it with, but now some of the experts that I read are talking about a K-shaped economic recovery. Well, what the heck does that mean? What that means is that there's an upper income group of society whose incomes are probably going to they're going to recover from this pretty quickly, pretty strongly. But then there is kind of everybody else, the mid and lower income strata, and their incomes are just going to continue to go down and with no immediate recovery in sight. I sure hope that's wrong, but from where we sit right now, this COVID-19 event has probably increased economic inequality. Well, I don't think there's any question. There are people who can work from home or otherwise don't have to be around other people to do their jobs that their employment has not been affected. And then, of course, there's people in the food service side and elsewhere who've been laid off and haven't been able to work. This is having effects on food security due to some of the hoarding behavior and some of the protracted difficulties with logistics that I'm going to make reference to here in a moment. And then finally, if you think about the budgets for food globally in different countries being tied to people's incomes and countries' GDP, if we're into what could be a long-tailed recession, well, we would worry about that, particularly in our protein markets, our pork, beef, some of the feed grains or feedstuffs that we export to other countries for livestock to supply proteins. We would worry about all Logistics capacity was very badly affected by this. So when you've got people, let's say in China, who are locked down, can't go to work, well, they can't move stuff off the dock, they can't unload containers. So whereas previously you had a particular kind of a turnaround time on a shipping container, that may have been greatly extended to the point where, I think I mentioned earlier, at one point Bloomberg had argued there weren't enough shipping containers in the world to deal with all of the demand. And you know that exacerbates related issues that you'd have with the railways, related issues that you'd have with trucking that relate to ocean-going containers, and then of course the ongoing problem that we have throughout the economy, accessing and retaining good drivers. The various problems and difficulties related to COVID-19 have inspired what I would call here a new theater for trade protection and protectionism, ag support, out of concern for food security and health. But again, some of these play into the general environment that was there before COVID-19. So, you know, a great example. At various points, our meat plants have been delisted or suspended from export to China. So the latest thing is that and of course in 2019 we had a period from the early summer into the fall where, as a category, the meat industry was out of China. That was lifted, but there's some plants that never did get back in after that. And what they will do is they will swab a cardboard box that the product is shipped in for COVID, and if they find it, well then, you know, that box is out, that load's out, and actually that exporter's out. Well, look, if you, in the environment we're in the logistics system, if you swab for this, you're going to find it. You know, maybe they should cook their meat. These are technical issues that are being leveraged to contribute to an already difficult geopolitical and trade environment. Another example, of course, is the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, the successor of the Market Facilitation Program in the US, which has given that much richer support, broader across commodities, deeper in terms of the caps on payments individual farmers can receive. And it makes it very, very difficult for Canada as a smaller country without the Treasury to compete with that support. And similarly, you know, in a particular ag policy structure that doesn't work well with these type of ad hoc payments. It's a very difficult situation for it. So just a little bit of illustration of some of these points. This happens to be the continuous futures chart for soybean oil. And, you know, there's a number of factors at play here, no doubt, but you look into the spring, as crude oil prices were crashing, no big surprise here, soybean oil went down as well. Contributing factor to that, of course, was the decline in food service, cooking oil demand, and also the logistics to move a lot of the product to markets, the logistics to move soybeans into China, whatever demand there was, just related to the clogging up of docks, not enough containers. I remember at one point, I stand corrected, I believe it was Maersk, but I would have to check on that to confirm. One of the major shipping companies anyway, they said they weren't even going to call on Chinese ports, which is a kind of a remarkable development when you stop and think about it. Market power in retail was a problem, a concern before, but with food service demand down, therefore the effective demand for food-facing retailers going up, retailers have achieved just that much more market power, and you're going to see them leveraging it. So I think many people have heard about this recent push by Walmart to begin charging their suppliers 1.25%. to fund some of their development. And I think part of the thinking is that, well, you know, they kept going through the height of the spring COVID crisis. So, you know, they'd like their suppliers to be able to fund some of this. Let's remember, everything goes back to the farm, everything. And this is a very difficult situation, and we should be concerned about this. I expect that the other retailers will probably follow suit with this. They certainly have before in the past. What can we learn about this, or learn from our experience so far? Well, first of all, you know, you can read a lot about this. There's a lot of you know, patting ourselves on the back and things, and I think that's fine, because really the food system overall held up pretty well. Now, you know, I've focused here a little bit on what some of the concerns were, what we could have done better, what we need to anticipate in the future. I think in some respects, frankly, we got lucky. You know, sometimes it's better to be lucky than smart, but we like to be smart just the same, especially because we know we're nowhere near out of the woods on this yet. What has happened, I think, you know, perhaps without due attention to it, is that our supply chains have aligned themselves to be, you know, through competition, they're ultra efficient, but we've cut out a lot of redundancies in the system. And one example that I've talked about is this distribution center model for supplying grocery stores. You know, you go by a grocery distribution center, and it's an immense warehouse, and you think, wow, they must store a lot of stuff in there. No, they don't. They move it through real fast. They're trying to turn over the square footage as quickly as they possibly can. We don't have a strategic storage of products for grocery. And we may want to reflect on that, given the experience that we've had. It will be costly, but also worth thinking about. As you face decline in one customer segment, food service, it boosts the market power of another retailer. And we need to be cognizant of that and think about that. As we look forward from this, you know, we worried that we already had the elements of a global recession from some of the aspects of trade policy disruption, particularly the decline in rules-based trade, and the geopolitical shenanigans between the U.S. and China that could trigger a global recession, or certainly a recession in Canada. Well, there's no question COVID-19 could exacerbate or extend or catalyze that, and we need to be concerned about that. In the height of this, there were a number of countries that got spooked and began to hoard their product. Russia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, there's probably others. If you're interested, there's a website that's dedicated to keeping track of countries that begin to put on export bans so that they feed their own first before they export. We didn't get into that, and that's to our credit. However, we also need to think about our own food security, not really in the products that we export, more along the lines of products that we import, and it's particularly fruit and vegetables. The same way we had difficulties with human resources and farm workers being sick and having to handle all that appropriately and the difficulties, so did the US, so did Mexico. And of course, off season, where is it we import our fruits and vegetables? Well, Mexico and the US. So we need to be worried about that. And I wonder if over time we will want to think about having more fruit and vegetable production in Canada, which of course means to a large extent in Ontario as a hedge against that. So what are some implications or ideas we can take going forward from this? Well, certainly one lesson that I learned, you know, I thought I knew how the different pieces of the supply chain work together really at a pretty detailed level. And I certainly was surprised. Not by the pressure. Well, I was surprised by the pressure-treated lumber thing, but that's not the biggest one. This, you know, just another example. apparently compressed CO2 is a byproduct of, among other things, the ethanol industry. Well, as you had more and more pressure in hospitals from people on ventilators, there was more and more demand for pressurized CO2, which is used in hospitals. There was less supply of it because the ethanol demand went down, and some of the plants took some of their production levels down. Well, we reached a point where this became a real concern on the commercial frozen storage side because they use compressed CO2 as a refrigerant. Well, holy cats! Who'd have figured out that, that compressed CO2 could be an issue? Now, again, we got through it, and it didn't cause a crisis. But this is a very complex situation, and I think we really need to do a better job of identifying it, understanding it, and then stress testing it to understand where the bottlenecks are. Now, interestingly, some of these stress tests are things that we've done in the past planning that we've done for foreign animal disease and plant disease emergencies. So one example, some of you may remember several years ago, we had a simulation of a foreign animal disease in poultry, and that was planned out and executed at a high degree of precision, and we figured out where our strengths were, where the gaps were, and that part of the industry I think has really acted to target and fill those gaps. We really haven't thought about this from a human disease perspective, and I think one of the things we learned is that this is more complex if it's a human disease issue than it is an animal or plant disease issue, and we need to be able to plan for that. Our sector is free enterprise, market-based, highly competitive, and that's good from the standpoint that we deliver very high value to the consumer, and food prices are low. However, that relentless competition, I think, has taken out some of the redundancies that would have proved beneficial to us. And thinking again about that curve I had there with the two different bowls and the red ball, it's the redundancies in the system that'll keep that ball from rolling over the hump and going down into that lower irreversible state, which has lower system performance. So one of the things I think we can take going forward is ask ourselves, are there ways we can engineer in redundancies or flexibilities in our system, or triage in terms of how we switch back and forth across segments to do things better in anticipation that something like this can happen. I think I've probably said enough about how emergency situations can shift market power, but that's a serious situation. We haven't had a lot of attention for probably the last 10 or 15 years on this matter, and that I think we need to get back around to that. One of the things that Canada can do, a role that we can play internationally, is we can commit to being a reliable, sustainable exporter as part of our foreign policy and trade policy. Because I think some of the importing countries who could be strong allies of ours, they get deathly afraid when some of their suppliers start to hoard food. I mentioned the history with Japan and the US resulting in the early development of the Brazilian soybean industry. Things like that will happen again. Finally, one of the things that the US has done that, to the best of my knowledge, we haven't really done, at least not at the federal level or in a fulsome way, is designating agri-food as a critical industry that needs to be prioritized and coordinated in an emergency planning and management context. So we don't want to be in a situation in which we've got, if you're thinking about public health authorities, neighboring public health authorities treating the ag and food sector differently, or not prioritizing it in a particular way. If we're going to close down a food processing plant just as quickly as we would a a shoe factory or a steel mill or whatever it is. We shouldn't be doing that. We need to prioritize food, and I'm not sure that that's wired in as a priority and designated as a critical industry. And that's something that we can emphasize in policy. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen.